Sometimes the dead speak louder than the living. I'm Miss Marple. Welcome to my new case.
The village hall of St. Mary Mead had never looked more festive, though Miss Jane Marple, settled comfortably in her usual corner chair with her knitting, observed that the decorations this year possessed a certain forced gaiety. Paper chains looped somewhat desperately from beam to beam, and the enormous Christmas tree seemed to lean with the weight of too many well-meaning ornaments. The annual Christmas Eve charity concert was proceeding with its customary blend of enthusiasm and mild catastrophe. Young Timothy Hartwell had already forgotten half the words to Good King Wenceslas, and Mrs. Price Ridley's piano accompaniment bore only a passing resemblance to the printed music. What made this evening different, Miss Marple reflected as her needles clicked steadily, was the presence of Mr. Reginald Thornfield. The London businessman had purchased Millfield House 6 weeks ago, bringing with him an aura of expensive cologne and barely concealed impatience with village customs. He sat in the front row, his Savile Row suit a stark contrast to the tweeds and woolens surrounding him, checking his gold pocket watch with increasing frequency. "Charming little performance," he had announced loudly during the interval, his voice carrying that particular tone of condescension that made several villagers stiffen. "Though I dare say we could improve the acoustics considerably. I've had some thoughts about modernizing this place. Proper heating, electric lighting throughout. Perhaps even a small stage extension." Miss Marple had noticed the quick exchange of glances between Colonel Melchett and Dr. Haydock. She had also observed Mrs. Bantry's fingers tighten around her teacup when Mr. Thornfield mentioned his vision for community improvement. The businessman seemed oblivious to the subtle chill his suggestions had created. During the second half, as the children's choir attempted Silent Night with varying degrees of success, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to several small details. Mr. Thornfield had accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Dolly Bantry, but she noticed he set it aside after barely a sip, his nose wrinkling slightly. Young Peter Carmody, the solicitor, kept glancing nervously toward the exit, though whether from boredom or anxiety, Miss Marple could not determine. Most intriguingly, she observed that someone had moved the small Christmas cactus from the window-sill to the refreshment table, an odd relocation that seemed to serve no practical purpose. The evening's crescendo came with the traditional community singing of "We Wish You a Merry Christmas." Mr. Thornfield participated with theatrical enthusiasm, his baritone voice drowning out those around him. As the final notes faded, he rose with obvious relief. "Delightful evening," he proclaimed, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some important calls to make before midnight. Business never sleeps, you know, not even on Christmas Eve." He collected his overcoat and walking stick, pausing only to shake hands with the vicar and nod curtly to Mrs. Bantry. Miss Marple watched him stride toward the door, noting his sudden urgency after an evening of studied patience. The lights chose that moment to flicker, a common occurrence in the old hall's temperamental electrical system. For perhaps 30 seconds, the room was plunged into darkness, filled with the gentle sounds of people carefully not bumping into one another and Joe Hargreaves muttering about fuses. When the lights returned, steadier than before, the hall resumed its cheerful bustle. It was Mrs. Bantry who first noticed that Mr. Thornfield's walking stick lay abandoned by his chair, though the man himself was nowhere to be seen. "How odd," she murmured to Miss Marple. "He was so particular about that stick, said it belonged to his grandfather." A search of the hall proved fruitless. It was young Timothy Hartwell, retrieving his forgotten gloves from the coat room, who made the discovery. His piercing scream cut through the evening's gentle murmur like a blade through silk. Mr. Reginald Thornfield sat slumped in the small anteroom behind the stage, his expensive suit now rumpled, his face bearing an expression of profound surprise. The teacup that had been in his hand lay shattered on the floor, its contents spreading in a dark stain across the worn boards. On the small table beside him, someone had placed a sprig of mistletoe, though Miss Marple was quite certain it hadn't been there during the evening's preparations. Dr. Haydock arrived within minutes, his examination swift but thorough. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done," he announced quietly. "He's been dead for some time." As the constable was summoned and the hall filled with whispered speculation, Miss Marple remained in her corner, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Her pale blue eyes moved thoughtfully from the abandoned walking stick to the broken teacup, from the mysteriously relocated cactus to the sprig of mistletoe that seemed to mock the season's spirit of goodwill. The businessman who had been so eager to modernize their little village would indeed never see Christmas morning, but Miss Marple suspected that his death was far more traditional than anything he might have planned. The news of Mr. Thornfield's death settled over the village hall like frost on glass, sudden, transforming, and impossible to ignore. Within minutes, the festive gathering had reorganized itself around this new, grim reality. Constable Polk, summoned from his Christmas Eve rounds, arrived with the breathless urgency of a man unaccustomed to dealing with anything more serious than poaching complaints. His notebook trembled slightly as he surveyed the scene, clearly wishing himself back to his cottage and a warm cup of cocoa. Dr. Haydock emerged from the anteroom, wiping his hands with a handkerchief, his expression grave. "I've done what I can for now," he announced quietly to Colonel Melchett. "Though I must say there are some rather curious aspects to this death. The man appears to have died quite suddenly, but there's a faint odor about him, almonds or perhaps marzipan, quite distinctive." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which had resumed their gentle clicking, paused almost imperceptibly at this observation. She had encountered that particular scent before, in circumstances that had nothing to do with Christmas confections. The villagers, meanwhile, had begun the age-old process of constructing explanations from the fragments of their shock and suspicion. Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to let a dramatic moment pass without commentary, had positioned herself near the piano where her voice would carry to the greatest number of listeners. "Mark my words," she declared with the authority of someone who had never been wrong about anything important. "It was the strain of modern business that killed him. These London types, always rushing about, never taking proper meals, living on their nerves. I said to Mr. Price Ridley just this evening that the man looked positively haggard." Colonel Melchett, however, harbored darker suspicions. "Nonsense, Martha," he said to Mrs. Bantry, though his voice carried far enough for others to hear. "A man doesn't shatter a teacup dying of natural causes. And that anteroom? Why would he go there unless he was meeting someone? No, this has the look of something deliberate about it." Peter Carmody, the young solicitor, shifted uncomfortably near the refreshment table. His professional training had taught him the value of careful words, but the evening's events seemed to have shaken his usual composure. "He did mention some business difficulties," he offered tentatively. "Nothing serious," he assured me, "but perhaps more pressing than he let on. These matters can weigh heavily on a man, particularly when he's trying to establish himself in a new community." Miss Marple observed how Mr. Carmody's hand remained firmly planted in his pocket, gripping something with white-knuckled determination. She also noted that he had moved closer to the Christmas cactus that someone had relocated from the windowsill, an odd migration that continued to puzzle her. Mrs. Bantry, still pale from the shock, confided her own theory to anyone within earshot. "He was such a demanding man, you know, always wanting to change things, modernize everything. The village fete committee, the heating system, even talked about replacing the church organ with something more efficient. Perhaps someone finally had enough of his interference." Young Timothy Hartwell, still clinging to his mother's coat, whispered something that made several adults lean closer. "He looked so surprised when I found him," the boy repeated, "like he'd seen something he didn't expect. People don't look surprised when their hearts give out, do they?" Joe Hargreaves, practical as always, offered his own explanation while examining the hall's electrical fixtures with renewed suspicion. "Could have been the lights going out that did it. Man gets startled, rushes toward the wrong door, trips and falls. That would account for the broken cup in the odd position. But Miss Marple had been present during the brief power failure, and she remembered distinctly that Mr. Thornfield had been moving toward the exit when the lights dimmed. His subsequent appearance in the anteroom suggested a deliberate change of direction, or perhaps an unplanned encounter. Dr. Haydock approached Constable Polk with obvious reluctance. "I'm afraid we'll need to notify the county police," he said quietly. "While I cannot rule out natural causes entirely, there are enough unusual circumstances to warrant a proper investigation. The position of the body, the broken teacup, and particularly that distinctive odor, these details suggest we may be dealing with something more complex than a simple heart attack." As if summoned by the doctor's words, the sound of a motor car could be heard approaching the hall. Inspector Slack from Much Benham had been roused from his own Christmas Eve celebrations, and his arrival would bring with it the full machinery of official investigation. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and rose slowly, accepting Mrs. Bantry's offered arm. As they prepared to leave, she paused near Mr. Thornfield's abandoned walking stick, noting the fine grit embedded in the silver knob's decorative crevices. It reminded her of the powder that accumulated on window sills in houses undergoing renovation or demolition. "Such a shame," she murmured to Mrs. Bantry as they made their way toward the door. "He seemed so eager to make his mark on our little village. Though I suppose, in a way, he has done exactly that." The night air struck them with crystalline clarity as they stepped outside. Behind them, the hall buzzed with continued speculation and the efficient bustle of Constable Polk taking statements. But Miss Marple's attention had already shifted to the larger pattern emerging from the evening's events. A pattern that suggested Mr. Thornfield's death was neither as sudden nor as accidental as it appeared. In the distance, Millfield House stood dark against the starlit sky, its new owner's ambitious plans for modernization now rendered permanently moot. Someone in St. Mary Mead had decided that some changes were simply too dangerous to allow, and they had chosen the most final method of prevention available. The question that remained was which of her seemingly innocent neighbors had possessed both the knowledge and the determination to commit murder on Christmas Eve, transforming their traditional celebration into something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Inspector Slack arrived with the crisp efficiency of a man accustomed to bringing order to chaos. His motor car's headlights swept across the village hall before settling into darkness, and within moments he had transformed the anxious gathering into a proper crime scene. Miss Marple, despite Mrs. Bantry's gentle urgings to return home, found herself a quiet corner where she could observe the proceedings while appearing to concentrate on her knitting. "Right then," Inspector Slack announced, consulting his pocket watch with theatrical precision. "Dr. Haydock, I'll need your preliminary findings immediately. Constable Polk, I trust the scene has been properly secured." Dr. Haydock's report proved more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. The distinctive almond scent had grown more pronounced during his examination, and he had discovered traces of a white crystalline substance on Mr. Thornfield's lips, barely visible to the naked eye, but unmistakably present. "The symptoms and evidence strongly suggest hydrocyanic acid," he explained quietly. "Swift onset, and that particular odor is quite characteristic. This was no natural death, Inspector." The revelation sent a ripple of shock through the remaining villagers. Murder was one thing to suspect, quite another to have confirmed with such clinical precision. Miss Marple's needles continued their gentle clicking, but her pale blue eyes missed nothing as Inspector Slack began his systematic questioning. "Mrs. Bantry?" the inspector called first. "I understand you served tea to the deceased during the interval." "I did indeed," Mrs. Bantry replied, wringing her hands nervously. "Though I must tell you something rather important. Mr. Thornfield insisted on using his own cup, a rather elaborate china piece with his initials engraved in gold. He carried it with him, you see. Said he couldn't abide drinking from common crockery. Quite particular about it, actually." Inspector Slack's eyebrows rose sharply at this information. His own cup? Then the broken china we found belonged to Mr. Thornfield personally. Oh, yes, Mrs. Bantry confirmed. He mentioned it was part of a valuable set inherited from his grandmother. Rather ostentatious for a village gathering, I thought, but he seemed quite proud of it. This revelation eliminated any possibility of random poisoning through the communal tea service. Someone had specifically targeted Mr. Thornfield, using intimate knowledge of his personal habits to ensure the poison reached its intended victim. Miss Marple found her attention drawn once again to the Christmas cactus, now positioned precisely where the tea service had been arranged. During her earlier observations, she had noticed someone moving near that table during the power failure, a shadowy figure she had initially dismissed as merely seeking refreshment in the darkness. "Mr. Carmody," Inspector Slack continued, beckoning the young solicitor forward. Peter's discomfort was immediately evident, his right hand still buried deep in his coat pocket, gripping something with white-knuckled determination. "I had minimal interaction with Mr. Thornfield this evening," Carmody replied, carefully. "He mentioned resolving his planning difficulties soon and that certain obstacles might prove less permanent than they appeared. I found his confidence somewhat premature." "And during the power failure," Slack pressed. "I was near the door," Peter said, too quickly. "I intended to step outside for air. The hall was quite warm. Ivy Sims, the hall's caretaker, provided the evening's next crucial detail. There were 6 cups on the tray after the interval," she explained, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. "After the lights flickered, one went missing. I thought perhaps the vicar had taken it for a parishioner, but he says he didn't. Then someone fetched that cup during the darkness," Inspector Slack concluded grimly. "Mr. Hargreaves, you were attending to the electrical failure." Joe Hargreaves scratched behind his ear thoughtfully. "The fuses dipped, but didn't go out entirely. I had my torch mined, saw shadows moving, people shifting about, but nothing I'd swear to in court." Miss Marple observed how Peter Carmody's gaze flickered involuntarily toward the refreshment table when Ivy mentioned the missing cup, then quickly away toward the dark space beyond the stage. She also noted a tiny, clear bead clinging to the edge of the Christmas cactus's leaf, viscid and glistening, as if transferred there by a careless hand. Mistletoe berries had a way of sticking to fingers, she recalled from long-ago village dances. Inspector Slack had moved to examine the anteroom more thoroughly, his flashlight revealing details invisible during the initial discovery. Why would he choose this particular room for his telephone calls? He mused aloud. "That room's got the only working telephone connection in the building," Joe explained helpfully. "Had to run new lines there last month when the old system failed. If he wanted privacy for his calls, that would be the logical place." The information provided a plausible explanation for Mr. Thornfield's presence in the anteroom, but it also suggested something more chilling. The killer had planned this murder with considerable forethought, choosing a moment and location that would ensure privacy for their deadly work. As the first pale light of Christmas morning began to filter through the hall's windows, Inspector Slack concluded his initial questioning. He had established the method, cyanide poisoning, and the means, the victim's own teacup. What remained was identifying which of St. Mary Mead's seemingly innocent residents had possessed both the knowledge and the ruthless determination to commit murder on Christmas Eve. Miss Marple quietly gathered her knitting, her mind already working through the evening's accumulating evidence. Someone in their peaceful village had decided that Mr. Thornfield's ambitious plans for change warranted the ultimate prevention, and they had chosen the season of goodwill to deliver their final judgment. The pale light of Christmas morning transformed the village hall from a scene of festive tragedy into something resembling a proper investigation. Inspector Slack had arrived with the methodical efficiency that marked his approach to criminal matters, and by dawn he had established a systematic process that would have impressed Scotland Yard itself. The body had been respectfully removed under Dr. Haydick's supervision, the anteroom sealed with official tape, and the remaining evidence catalogued with bureaucratic precision. Miss Marple remained in her corner, knitting needles moving with deceptive casualness as she observed the proceedings. Something about the entire sequence of events troubled her deeply, though she could not yet articulate the source of her unease. The pieces fitted together too neatly, like a jigsaw puzzle where someone had forced the wrong shapes into place. "Now then," Inspector Slack announced, consulting his notebook with theatrical authority. "Let us establish the facts systematically. Mrs. Bantry, you served tea to the deceased during the interval?" "Indeed I did," Mrs. Bantry confirmed, wringing her hands nervously. "Though I must tell you something rather significant. Mr. Thornfield insisted upon using his own cup, a rather elaborate china piece with his initials engraved in gold. He carried it with him everywhere, claimed he couldn't abide drinking from common crockery. Quite particular about such things." Inspector Slack's eyebrows rose sharply at this revelation. "His own cup? Then the broken china we discovered belonged to Mr. Thornfield personally?" "Oh, yes," Mrs. Bantry replied. "Part of a valuable inherited set, he mentioned. Rather ostentatious for a village gathering, but he seemed quite proud of it." This information eliminated any possibility of random poisoning through the communal tea service. Someone had specifically targeted Mr. Thornfield, using intimate knowledge of his personal habits to ensure the poison reached its intended victim. Miss Marple found this detail particularly significant. It suggested premeditation of the most calculating sort. "Mr. Carmody," Inspector Slack called, beckoning the young solicitor forward. Peter's discomfort was immediately apparent, his pale complexion and nervous gestures marking him as a man under considerable strain. His right hand remained buried deep in his coat pocket, gripping something with white-knuckled determination. "I understand you are handling Mr. Thornfield's legal affairs," Slack began, his tone deceptively conversational. "Business matters can become quite contentious, particularly when large sums are involved." Peter cleared his throat carefully. Mr. Thornfield was indeed a demanding client. He had ambitious plans for property development, including the controversial purchase of the old mill site. There were certain complications regarding planning permissions and local objections. "Complications that might have threatened your professional reputation?" Slack pressed, leaning forward with predatory interest. "Any disagreements were purely professional," Peter replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "I stood to gain considerably from his continued patronage, Inspector. His death benefits no one, least of all myself." Miss Marple observed how Peter's gaze flickered involuntarily toward the Christmas cactus, still positioned near where the tea service had been arranged. She had noticed earlier that someone had moved the plant from its original windowsill location, though no one seemed willing to claim responsibility for the relocation. More intriguingly, a tiny transparent thread still clung to one of its leaves. Vicin from mistletoe berries, if her botanical knowledge served correctly. "During the power failure," Inspector Slack continued relentlessly, "several witnesses observed you moving toward the refreshment area. The missing teacup disappeared during that same interval. Rather coincidental, wouldn't you say?" Peter's composure began to crack visibly. "I felt unwell from the heat. I was seeking fresh air, nothing more. The darkness was disorienting. I may have moved in the wrong direction initially." Dr. Haydock, who had been listening with professional interest, interjected quietly. "Inspector, I've been considering the timing of the poisoning. Cyanide acts very rapidly, within minutes of ingestion. If Mr. Thornfield consumed the poison during the interval, he should have collapsed almost immediately, not survived until after the concert's conclusion." This observation sent a ripple of uncertainty through the assembled villagers. Inspector Slack, however, seemed determined to maintain his focus on the obvious suspect. "Mr. Carmody, what are you concealing in your pocket? Your behavior suggests you're hiding something of considerable importance." With obvious reluctance, Peter withdrew his hand, revealing not the incriminating evidence Slack expected, but a small glass vial containing crystalline residue. The acrid scent that rose from it was unmistakable, and Dr. Haydock's sharp intake of breath confirmed everyone's suspicions. "Potassium cyanide," the doctor announced grimly. The same substance that killed Mr. Thornfield. The discovery seemed to seal Peter's fate. Inspector Slack's satisfaction was evident as he formally placed the young solicitor under arrest, despite Peter's increasingly desperate protestations of innocence. As the constable led him away, Miss Marple reflected on the convenience of finding such damning evidence so easily. In her considerable experience with human nature, murderers who planned their crimes with sufficient sophistication to exploit their victims' personal habits rarely made such elementary mistakes as carrying evidence in their pockets. The entire scenario felt orchestrated, as if someone had carefully arranged Peter's apparent guilt while ensuring their own escape from suspicion. The obvious solution sat neat and satisfying before them, too neat. For St. Mary Mead, where the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most helpful in solving their own crimes. The arrest of Peter Carmody should have brought resolution to the Christmas Eve tragedy. Yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly unsettled by the neat conclusion Inspector Slack had reached. As the constable led the young solicitor away, his desperate protestations echoing across the emptying hall, she remained in her corner chair, knitting needles, moving with deceptive casualness while her mind worked through the accumulating inconsistencies. Dr. Haydock's earlier observation continued to trouble her most profoundly. Cyanide acted with ruthless efficiency. Victims typically collapsed within minutes of ingestion. Yet she distinctly remembered Mr. Thornfield's booming baritone during the final carol, his theatrical enthusiasm as the concert concluded, his impatient consultation of that gold pocket watch. He had been vibrantly, unmistakably alive long after the interval when the poisoned tea was supposedly administered. "Inspector," she said quietly, rising with Mrs. Bantry's assistance, "might I help tidy the refreshment area? It seems rather a shame to leave such disorder on Christmas morning." Inspector Slack, absorbed in his paperwork and satisfied with his swift resolution, waved a distracted hand of consent. Miss Marple approached the tea service with the careful attention of someone genuinely concerned with propriety, though her pale blue eyes missed nothing as she began straightening cups and saucers. "Such beautiful silver, Dolly," she murmured to Mrs. Bantry, lifting the sugar tongs with delicate precision. "Your grandmother's set, if I recall correctly." "Indeed," Mrs. Bantry replied, though her voice carried the strain of the morning's events. "Though I fear they've suffered somewhat in all the excitement." Miss Marple held the tongs to the light, noting a curious dulling on the inner surface of one prong, a grayish bloom that seemed oddly out of place on otherwise bright silver. She had encountered similar tarnishing before, in circumstances involving certain chemical compounds that reacted poorly with precious metals. "How curious," she observed mildly. "This discoloration suggests contact with something rather more caustic than sugar. Perhaps someone used them for salt or lemon." Ivy Sims, who had been nervously rearranging the remaining refreshments, looked up with obvious anxiety. "I kept everything proper, Miss Marple. Nothing but ordinary sugar lumps in the bowl, same as always." "Of course, dear," Miss Marple replied soothingly, though she noticed how Ivy's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "You've always maintained everything so beautifully, though I did notice you moved that charming Christmas cactus from the windowsill. Such an odd little plant. One must be careful what touches its leaves." "It looked lonely there," Ivy said quickly. "I thought it might be prettier by the tea service." Miss Marple examined the succulent more closely, noting a tiny crystalline residue clinging to one waxy leaf, barely visible unless viewed from precisely the right angle. The substance possessed the characteristic transparency of something that had been dissolved and allowed to dry, leaving microscopic traces of its presence. Dr. Haydock, who had been preparing to leave, approached with professional curiosity. "Miss Marple, you seem troubled by something beyond young Carmody's arrest." "The timing continues to perplex me," she admitted. "If Mr. Thornfield consumed poison during the interval, surely he would have succumbed before the concert's end. Yet I observed him participating enthusiastically in our final carol." "You're quite right," Dr. Haydock said slowly. The concentration of residue I discovered suggests the poison was administered much closer to the time of death, perhaps even after he left his seat. This revelation sent a chill through the small group. Inspector Slack, overhearing, approached with obvious irritation. The evidence against Carmody is overwhelming. He had means, motive, and opportunity. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, slipping the tarnished tongs into her knitting basket. Though one does wonder who served Mr. Thornfield his final cup of tea. The timing suggests it occurred after the concert concluded. Ivy's face went pale. I brought him a fresh cup when he said he needed to make his telephone calls. He was in such a hurry, waved away the sugar bowl entirely. I was only trying to be helpful. Helpfulness is such a virtue, Miss Marple observed gently, though it can be exploited by those who understand it. Tell me, Ivy, how long have you been concerned about Mr. Thornfield's plans for modernizing the hall? The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. Ivy's position as caretaker represented not merely employment, but her entire social standing in the village. Mr. Thornfield's ambitious renovations would have eliminated her role entirely, replacing her devoted service with modern efficiency and professional caterers. As Christmas morning strengthened around them, Miss Marple realized that the most dangerous criminal in St. Mary Mead had successfully orchestrated an elaborate deception using intimate knowledge of both chemistry and human nature to commit murder while ensuring an innocent man faced the consequences. The challenge now lay in proving her theory before Peter Carmody's fate was sealed by a justice system convinced of his guilt. The silver tongs in her basket carried their own testimony, evidence that would speak eloquently of calculated murder disguised as helpful service on the holiest morning of the year. Ivy's admission about serving Mr. Thornfield his final cup of tea hung in the morning air like incense, heavy with implication. Miss Marple observed how the caretaker's hands trembled slightly as she spoke, though whether from guilt or merely the shock of being so closely questioned remained unclear. Inspector Slack, still flush with satisfaction from Peter Carmody's arrest, seemed inclined to dismiss this revelation as merely helpful cooperation from a conscientious employee. "Natural enough," he said briskly, consulting his pocket watch. The man requested refreshment for his telephone calls. Nothing suspicious in that. Miss Marple, however, had begun to perceive a more intricate pattern emerging from the morning's accumulating details. She withdrew the tarnished silver tongs from her knitting basket, holding them delicately to catch the light streaming through the hall's windows. "Such beautiful craftsmanship, Dolly," she murmured to Mrs. Bantry, "though I notice this curious discoloration on the inner surfaces, rather like the tarnishing one sees when silver contacts certain chemical compounds." Dr. Haydock approached with professional interest, examining the implement with practiced eyes. "You're quite right, Miss Marple. That particular pattern of oxidation suggests contact with something considerably more caustic than ordinary sugar. The reaction is quite distinctive." "I kept everything proper," Ivy said quickly, her voice rising with defensive anxiety. "Nothing but regular sugar lumps, same as always. I've been doing this for 16 years. I know my duties." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes rested gently on the agitated woman. "Of course you do, dear. Such devoted service to our little community, though one does wonder about that charming Christmas cactus. I noticed you moved it from the windowsill to the refreshment table. Such an unusual relocation for a plant that prefers consistent positioning." "It looked lonely by the window," Ivy replied, wringing her hands in her apron. "I thought it might brighten the tea service." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, approaching the succulent with the careful attention of someone genuinely interested in horticulture. Upon closer examination, she could discern tiny crystalline deposits clinging to several waxy leaves, barely visible unless viewed from precisely the right angle, but unmistakably present. Mrs. Bantry, following Miss Marple's gaze, suddenly stiffened with realization. "Jane, that looks rather like..." Salt crystals, perhaps, Miss Marple interrupted gently. Though the formation suggests something that was dissolved in liquid and allowed to dry naturally. One encounters similar residues when certain household substances are mixed with water. Inspector Slack, finally grasping the potential significance of these observations, approached with renewed attention. Miss Sims, you seem remarkably distressed for someone who merely served refreshments. Perhaps you could clarify exactly when you learned of Mr. Thornfield's modernization plans. The direct question seemed to shatter Ivy's remaining composure entirely. 3 weeks ago, she whispered, her voice barely audible. He told me himself, said my services would no longer be required after his renovations. 30 years of family service. My mother held this position before me, and her mother before that. 3 generations of Sims women keeping this place proper, dismissed like we were nothing more than outdated fixtures. The raw pain in her voice was unmistakable, and Miss Marple recognized the particular desperation that could drive someone to extraordinary measures when their entire world faced destruction. Mr. Thornfield's casual modernization represented not merely unemployment for Ivy, but the complete erasure of her family's legacy and her own identity. He laughed when I asked about redundancy pay, Ivy continued, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Said I should be grateful for the notice, that most employers wouldn't bother with such courtesies for ancillary staff. Called me ancillary, Miss Marple, after everything I've done for this community. Dr. Haydock, who had been quietly examining the Christmas cactus, looked up with sudden concern. Miss Marple, this plant shows signs of recent handling, broken leaf edges, disturbed soil, and there are traces of what appears to be a white crystalline substance mixed into the potting medium. How curious, Miss Marple observed mildly. One wonders what might require such careful concealment among plant roots, though I suppose someone with extensive knowledge of cleaning supplies might know which household compounds could prove dangerous if concentrated properly. The implication sent a chill through the assembled group. Ivy Sims possessed not only clear motive and opportunity, but also the practical knowledge necessary to commit sophisticated murder using materials readily available in her caretaker's supplies. Yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by the very neatness of this solution. In her considerable experience with human nature, the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most helpful in solving their own crimes. Someone in St. Mary Mead had orchestrated this entire sequence of events with remarkable precision, ensuring that suspicion would fall upon the obvious candidates, while the true murderer remained safely hidden among the concerned villagers offering assistance to the investigation. As Christmas morning strengthened around them, Miss Marple realized that the most challenging aspect of this case lay not in identifying suspects with motive and means, but in determining which of several plausible explanations represented the actual truth. The silver tongs, the relocated cactus, and Ivy's desperate circumstances formed a compelling narrative, perhaps too compelling for a crime that had been planned with such meticulous attention to detail. Ivy's tearful confession about serving Mr. Thornfield his final cup of tea should have provided Inspector Slack with the resolution he sought, yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the convenient succession of obvious suspects. As Ivy dabbed at her eyes with her apron, her desperation genuine and heartbreaking, the hall's main door opened with a sharp creak that drew everyone's attention away from the weeping caretaker. Mrs. Price Ridley entered with obvious agitation, clutching a leather portfolio against her chest like a shield. "Inspector Slack," she announced breathlessly. "I've made a most disturbing discovery. After hearing about poor Mr. Thornfield's death, I thought someone should check his briefcase. He left it in the vicarage yesterday evening during his meeting with Reverend Clement about the heating system renovations." She thrust the portfolio toward the inspector with trembling hands. "The contents are most illuminating and deeply troubling." Inspector Slack accepted the case with obvious reluctance, clearly preferring his neat solution to any complications. However, as he examined the meticulously organized documents within, his expression shifted from irritation to genuine alarm. The papers revealed not the straightforward business dealings of an ambitious developer, but the systematic documentation of a predator who had been methodically identifying and exploiting the vulnerabilities of St. Mary Mead's residents. "Good heavens," Dr. Haydock murmured, reading over the inspector's shoulder. "These aren't business records. They're blackmail files." Miss Marple observed how several faces in the assembled group registered not surprise, but something closer to recognition, as if this revelation confirmed rather than shocked them. Peter Carmody's earlier words about Mr. Thornfield's confidence in overcoming obstacles suddenly took on sinister new meaning. The documents detailed threats against Mrs. Eleanor Prescott regarding a legal technicality that could cost her the cottage that had housed 3 generations of her family. There were records of pressure applied to Colonel Melchett concerning an old military incident, correspondence threatening to expose Joe Hargreaves's unlicensed electrical work that violated safety codes, and most damning of all, evidence of systematic financial manipulation designed to force property sales at fractions of their true value. "He was bleeding the village dry," Mrs. Bantry whispered, her face pale with shock, "making people desperate, then swooping in to profit from their misery." Miss Marple noted how Joe Hargreaves had gone very still during this recitation, his weathered hands clenched at his sides. The electrical work mentioned in the documents would explain his access to the hall systems, his knowledge of the telephone connections, and his familiarity with the building's layout during the crucial power failure. "Such a dangerous game," she observed mildly, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. "Blackmail requires such delicate timing, too much pressure too quickly, and desperate people resort to desperate measures." As if summoned by her words, a commotion arose near the refreshment table where Constable Polk was examining the remaining evidence. He had been attempting to move the Christmas cactus when the pot shifted, revealing something that made him cry out in alarm. Nestled among the plant's roots, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a small glass vial identical to the one found in Peter Carmody's pocket. "Another one," Polk announced grimly. "Same type of container, same residue." The discovery sent a chill through the assembled villagers. Someone had prepared multiple doses of poison, suggesting premeditation of the most calculating sort. More troubling still, the vial's placement indicated it had been hidden after the murder, during the confusion following the body's discovery. Inspector Slack's earlier satisfaction had completely evaporated. "This changes everything," he admitted reluctantly. "We're not dealing with a crime of passion or simple revenge. Someone orchestrated this entire evening with remarkable precision." Miss Marple examined the oiled cloth that had protected the vial, noting its particular weave and the faint scent of machine oil that clung to its fibers. She had encountered similar material in Joe Hargreaves's toolkit during previous village maintenance projects. Yet the very obviousness of this connection troubled her. In her experience, the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most helpful in solving their own crimes. "The question," she said thoughtfully, "is whether we're meant to find this evidence, or whether someone has been rather careless in their cleanup efforts." Dr. Haydock, who had been quietly examining the second vial, looked up with professional concern. "The concentration here is much higher than what killed Mr. Thornfield. This dose would have been instantly fatal. No time for the victim to reach the anteroom or make telephone calls." This observation cast the entire sequence of events in a new light. The murderer had prepared for multiple contingencies, perhaps planning to eliminate several threats to their security in a single evening. The Christmas Eve concert had provided perfect cover for systematic assassination, with the power failure offering crucial moments of darkness for the killer to move undetected. As Christmas morning strengthened around them, Miss Marple realized they were dealing with someone who understood not merely chemistry and human nature, but the very mechanics of investigation itself. The killer had anticipated every development, prepared multiple suspects, and even arranged evidence to guide the inquiry toward predetermined conclusions. The most chilling aspect of this crime lay not in its execution, but in its scope. Someone in their peaceful village had been planning mass murder, using the season of goodwill to mask the most calculated evil Miss Marple had ever encountered. The discovery of the second vial had transformed Inspector Slack's straightforward murder case into something far more complex and sinister. As the Christmas morning, light strengthened through the hall's windows, Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the convenient succession of evidence that seemed to present itself with theatrical timing. The oiled cloth, the hidden poison, the blackmail documents, each revelation felt orchestrated, as if someone with intimate knowledge of investigative procedures was carefully guiding the inquiry toward predetermined conclusions. "Inspector," she said quietly, rising from her corner chair with Mrs. Bantry's assistance, "might I suggest that we approach this matter with somewhat more subtlety? In my experience, the most dangerous criminals are often those who appear most helpful in solving their own crimes." Inspector Slack, still reeling from the implications of Mr. Thornfield's blackmail operation, looked up from the scattered documents with obvious frustration. "Miss Marple, we have clear evidence pointing to multiple suspects. The second vial suggests premeditation of the most calculating sort." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, her pale blue eyes moving thoughtfully across the assembled villagers. "Though one wonders about the timing of these discoveries. Such convenient evidence appearing precisely when needed to shift suspicion, it reminds me of a rather elaborate theatrical performance." Dr. Haydock, who had been quietly examining the medical evidence, approached with professional concern. "The concentration of poison in the second vial troubles me greatly. This dose would have been instantly fatal, far stronger than what actually killed Mr. Thornfield. It suggests either multiple intended victims or someone who prepared for various contingencies." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. "The question that continues to perplex me is the timing of the actual poisoning. If Mr. Thornfield consumed the fatal dose during the interval, he should have collapsed within moments. Yet we all heard his voice during the final carol, saw him consulting that gold pocket watch with obvious impatience." This observation sent a chill through the remaining villagers. Ivy Sims, still pale from her earlier emotional breakdown, wrung her hands nervously in her apron. Joe Hargreaves maintained his stoic expression, though Miss Marple noticed how his weathered fingers had begun to drum against his leg, a subtle sign of increasing anxiety. "There is something else that troubles me," Miss Marple continued, her voice carrying the gentle authority that made people listen despite themselves. "The matter of personal effects. In my experience, certain items retain evidence far longer than their owners might expect." She paused near the refreshment table, her attention drawn once again to the Christmas cactus that someone had relocated from the windowsill. "Mrs. Bantry, dear, might you ask the vicar to make a small announcement after the morning service? Perhaps suggest that anyone who might have mislaid gloves during last evening's excitement could collect them from the hall. Such items do accumulate during village gatherings." Mrs. Bantry looked puzzled, but nodded agreement. Inspector Slack, however, grasped the implications immediately. "You suspect the gloves might retain traces of the poison?" "Cyanide has such distinctive properties," Miss Marple replied mildly. "And leather, particularly fine kid leather, can be quite unforgiving when it comes to chemical stains. One either destroys the evidence entirely or attempts to clean it. Both approaches can be most revealing." The suggestion created an immediate stir among the assembled villagers. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had been standing near the exit with obvious impatience, suddenly discovered an urgent need to check on the carol books at the vestry. Joe Hargreaves began examining his hands with newfound interest, while Ivy Sims looked genuinely confused. "I lost my gloves last week," Ivy admitted tearfully. "Searched everywhere for them. Such a shame. They were my mother's best pair." Miss Marple found this detail particularly intriguing. In her considerable experience with human nature, lost gloves that reappeared at convenient moments often told their own stories. She also noticed how Peter Carmody's absence had created a vacuum that someone else was now eager to fill. Someone who understood the mechanics of investigation well enough to plant evidence while appearing to assist with the inquiry. As the church bells began calling the faithful to Christmas morning service, Miss Marple reflected on the intricate web of deception that had been woven around Mr. Thornfield's death. Someone in St. Mary Mead possessed not merely the knowledge to commit sophisticated murder, but the psychological sophistication to manipulate the subsequent investigation with remarkable precision. The killer had anticipated every development, prepared multiple suspects, and even arranged evidence to guide the inquiry toward predetermined conclusions. Yet in their very thoroughness, they had revealed something crucial about their own nature. This was someone who understood authority, who knew how investigations proceeded, and who felt confident enough in their position to orchestrate such elaborate misdirection. As the villagers began filing out toward the church, Miss Marple remained behind, ostensibly to tidy the hall, but actually to examine the scene with fresh eyes. The Christmas cactus still troubled her, not merely its relocation, but the tiny crystalline residue that clung to its waxy leaves like morning frost. Someone had used this innocent plant as both hiding place and message board, confident that their manipulations would guide the investigation exactly where they wished it to go. The challenge now lay in determining whether the evidence pointed toward the true murderer or represented the most sophisticated frame-up Miss Marple had ever encountered. The morning light revealed one final detail that had escaped earlier notice. A single strand of expensive thread caught on the cactus's spines, dark blue and finely woven, the sort used in only the most exclusive tailoring. It was a small thing, barely visible, yet it spoke eloquently of someone who had been far closer to the plant than they had admitted. The strand of expensive thread caught on the Christmas cactus's spines had provided Miss Marple with the final piece of evidence she needed, though she was careful not to reveal this to the assembled company. As the church bells finished calling the faithful to Christmas morning service, she found herself alone in the hall with the accumulated detritus of the evening's tragedy, the tarnished silver tongs, the relocated plant, and the growing collection of evidence that painted an increasingly complex picture of premeditated murder. Inspector Slack returned from his brief consultation with the constable, his expression bearing the particular frustration of a man whose neat solution had been thoroughly complicated by inconvenient facts. The Blackmail documents spread across the table like a malevolent feast, each page revealing another victim of Mr. Thornfield's systematic exploitation of village vulnerabilities. "The scope of this operation troubles me greatly," he admitted to Miss Marple, as she settled back into her corner chair, knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. The man wasn't simply conducting business, he was methodically destroying lives for profit. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her pale blue eyes moving across the evidence with the careful attention of someone assembling a particularly complex puzzle. "Indeed, Inspector, though I find myself wondering which of his victims finally decided that enough was enough. The psychological pressure must have been enormous for someone accustomed to respectability and social standing." As if summoned by her words, the hall's main door opened to admit Dr. Haydock, Colonel Melchett, and Mrs. Price Ridley, all returning from the Christmas service with expressions that suggested their thoughts had been far from seasonal devotion. Mrs. Bantry followed shortly after, her usual cheerful demeanor subdued by the morning's grim revelations. Miss Marple observed each arrival with renewed interest, noting subtle details that had previously escaped her attention. Colonel Melchett's military bearing seemed more pronounced than usual, as if he were preparing for battle. Dr. Haydock carried his medical bag despite the holiday, his professional instincts apparently overriding social convention. Mrs. Price Ridley moved with her characteristic authority, though Miss Marple detected a slight tremor in her usually steady hands. "I've been reflecting on the evening's sequence of events," Miss Marple announced pleasantly, and I find myself curious about certain small details that might help clarify our understanding. Would anyone be so kind as to demonstrate how they might have served refreshment to someone in Mr. Thornfield's particular circumstances? The request seemed innocent enough, yet it created an immediate tension in the assembled group. Inspector Slack looked puzzled by this apparent digression, while the villagers exchanged uncertain glances. "I should be happy to assist," Mrs. Price Ridley said briskly, moving toward the tea service with practiced efficiency, "though I fail to see how domestic arrangements relate to criminal investigation." Miss Marple watched with keen interest as Mrs. Price Ridley arranged cups and saucers with military precision, her movements economical and purposeful. When she reached for the silver tongs, however, Miss Marple noted a barely perceptible hesitation, a fraction of a second's pause before grasping the implement with confident authority. "Such beautiful silver, Dolly," Miss Marple murmured to Mrs. Bantry. "Though I notice these tongs show that curious discoloration Dr. Haydock mentioned, rather like the tarnishing one encounters when precious metals contact certain chemical compounds." Dr. Haydock approached to examine the implements more closely, his professional curiosity engaged. "The pattern is quite distinctive. Whatever caused this reaction was considerably more caustic than ordinary sugar or cream." Colonel Melchett, who had been standing near the Christmas cactus, suddenly stepped away from the plant as if it had become dangerous. Miss Marple observed this movement with particular interest, noting how his gaze flickered involuntarily toward the expensive thread still clinging to the succulent spines. "Such an interesting little plant," she observed mildly. "Someone took considerable care to relocate it from the windowsill, though I confess I cannot determine the purpose of such relocation. Unless, of course, it was meant to serve as both hiding place and message board for someone who understood the mechanics of investigation." The suggestion created a palpable shift in the room's atmosphere. Inspector Slack began to grasp the implications of Miss Marple's seemingly innocent observations, while the three potential suspects each displayed subtle signs of increasing anxiety. "The question that continues to perplex me," Miss Marple continued, her knitting needles clicking with deceptive casualness, "is the matter of timing. Dr. Haydock's medical expertise confirms that cyanide acts with ruthless efficiency. Yet Mr. Thornfield remained vibrantly alive throughout the concert's conclusion. This suggests the fatal dose was administered much later than initially assumed." She paused, allowing this information to settle over the assembled company like morning frost. Someone with intimate knowledge of both chemistry and human psychology orchestrated this entire evening with remarkable precision. They understood not merely how to commit murder, but how to manipulate the subsequent investigation toward predetermined conclusions. The accusation hung unspoken in the air, yet its implications were unmistakable. Someone among them possessed the sophistication to commit calculated murder while ensuring that innocent villagers would face suspicion for their crime. As Christmas morning strengthened around them, Miss Marple realized that her final test had confirmed her theory with devastating clarity. The killer's reaction to her careful probing had revealed not merely guilt, but the particular form of arrogance that came from believing oneself cleverer than both the law and human nature itself. The challenge now lay in orchestrating the revelation with sufficient precision to ensure justice while protecting the innocent members of their small community from further harm. In her considerable experience with human nature, she had learned that the most dangerous criminals were often those who convinced themselves they were acting for the greater good, and this murderer had demonstrated exactly that form of moral certainty. The thread on the cactus, the tarnished silver tongs, and the careful manipulation of evidence all pointed toward a killer who understood authority, investigation, and the psychology of guilt with professional expertise. Tomorrow's revelation would expose not merely a murderer, but someone who had betrayed the trust that formed the very foundation of village life. The silence that followed Miss Marple's gentle probing stretched taut as violin strings, each person in the hall acutely aware that the moment of revelation had arrived. She set her knitting aside with deliberate finality, her pale blue eyes moving across the assembled company with the careful attention of someone preparing to deliver judgment that would shatter their small world forever. I find myself compelled to address certain inconsistencies that have troubled me throughout this investigation, Miss Marple began, her voice carrying that deceptive gentleness that made the most devastating truths sound like observations about the weather. The timing of Mr. Thornfield's death, you see, tells us a story quite different from what we initially supposed. Inspector Slack shifted uncomfortably, sensing that his neat solution was about to crumble entirely. Dr. Haydock leaned forward with professional interest, while Colonel Melchett maintained his rigid military posture, though Miss Marple noticed how his hands had moved to clasp behind his back, concealing them from view. Dr. Haydock's medical expertise confirmed that cyanide acts with ruthless efficiency, she continued thoughtfully. Yet we all heard Mr. Thornfield's voice during our final carol, saw him consulting that gold pocket watch with obvious impatience. He was vibrantly, unmistakably alive long after the interval when the poisoned tea was supposedly administered. She rose slowly, accepting Mrs. Bantry's offered arm, and approached the refreshment table where the evidence of sophisticated deception lay scattered like pieces of a malevolent puzzle. The fatal dose was administered much later, when he went to make his telephone calls. Someone followed him to the anteroom, someone he trusted completely. Miss Marple lifted the tarnished silver tongs, holding them to catch the Christmas morning light. These beautiful implements tell their own story, don't they? The discoloration Dr. Haydock noted. Such a distinctive reaction occurs when precious metals contact certain caustic compounds. Someone used these tongs to handle crystalline cyanide, placing it precisely where it would dissolve into Mr. Thornfield's final cup of tea. Her attention turned to the Christmas cactus, still positioned where someone had carefully relocated it from the windowsill. And this charming little plant served multiple purposes: hiding place, message board, and ultimately, witness. For caught upon its spines, I discovered this. She extended her hand, revealing a single strand of expensive dark blue thread, barely visible yet unmistakably present. Finest quality worsted, the sort used only in the most exclusive Savile Row tailoring, such as the suit you're wearing, Colonel Melchett. The accusation hung in the air like morning frost. Colonel Melchett's military bearing wavered almost imperceptibly, though his voice remained steady when he spoke. Miss Marple, surely you don't suggest? I suggest that Mr. Thornfield's blackmail operation included a file on you, Colonel, she replied with devastating quietness. Something about a patrol incident years ago, perhaps. A casualty report signed in good faith but containing an error that could be twisted into something shameful by the right sort of bully. The color drained from Colonel Melchett's face as the accuracy of her deduction became apparent. Mrs. Bantry gasped softly, while Inspector Slack's hand moved instinctively toward his official notebook. You understood the Hall's systems intimately from years of committee service, Miss Marple continued relentlessly. You knew about the temperamental electrical connections, the location of the private telephone, Mr. Thornfield's meticulous habits regarding his personal teacup. During the power failure, while others were disoriented, you moved to the refreshment table and used these tongs to place a cyanide capsule into his cup, disguised perhaps as a sugar lump. The methodical reconstruction continued with inexorable precision. You knew he wouldn't drink immediately. Being occupied with the concert, you anticipated that Ivy would serve him fresh tea when he went to make his calls, dissolving the poison at exactly the right moment. The second vial hidden in the cactus, the evidence planted on poor Peter Carmody. Clever misdirection to ensure innocent villagers faced suspicion while you remained safely among the concerned citizens offering assistance. Colonel Melchett's composure finally cracked entirely. He was destroying everything decent about this place, he said quietly, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had carried an impossible burden too long. The systematic exploitation, the blackmail, someone had to stop him before he ruined more lives. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed with gentle understanding. Though murder is rarely the solution to moral outrage, however justified that outrage might appear. Inspector Slack rose slowly, his duty warring with personal shock at seeing a respected pillar of their community revealed as a calculated killer. "Colonel Melchett, I'm arresting you for the murder of Reginald Thornfield." As the handcuffs clicked shut, Miss Marple reflected sadly on how the season of goodwill had been transformed into something far more sinister by someone who had convinced himself he was acting for the greater good. The most dangerous criminals, she had learned, were often those who believed their cause justified any means, even murder on Christmas morning. The constable led Colonel Melchett away with quiet dignity, his military bearing finally surrendering to the weight of his confession. As the hall emptied of its official proceedings, a profound silence settled over St. Mary Mead. Not the comfortable quiet of a peaceful village, but the stunned hush that follows the shattering of fundamental assumptions about human nature and community trust. Inspector Slack approached Miss Marple with uncharacteristic humility, his notebook closed and forgotten in his hands. "I owe you considerable apologies, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "My haste to find simple solutions nearly condemned innocent people. The timing was always the crucial element, wasn't it?" "Indeed, Inspector," Miss Marple replied gently, her knitting needles resuming their soft rhythm. "Cyanide acts with such ruthless efficiency that Mr. Thornfield's participation in our final carol told us everything we needed to know about when the fatal dose was actually administered. The Colonel understood this perfectly. He knew the poison needed to be placed where it would dissolve only when fresh tea was added during those crucial telephone calls. Dr. Haydock, completing his official duties with professional thoroughness, paused to examine the tarnished silver tongs one final time. The chemical evidence was quite clear once we knew what to look for. The discoloration pattern on these implements tells its own story of careful preparation and calculated murder. Peter Carmody arrived shortly after his release, pale but profoundly relieved, his gratitude toward Miss Marple evident in every gesture. "I still don't understand how the Colonel managed to plant that vial in my pocket," he admitted, his voice shaky with the realization of how close he had come to facing charges for murder. Committee work and years of village service provided him with countless opportunities to move among people unnoticed, Miss Marple explained kindly. During the confusion following the power failure, a gentle pat on the shoulder or helpful gesture could easily transfer evidence from one pocket to another. He understood human psychology well enough to predict exactly how you would react to finding such damning evidence. Ivy Sims, still trembling from her emotional ordeal, approached with tears of gratitude. "Miss Marple, if you hadn't seen through his deception, I might have faced suspicion myself. My job, my family's legacy, everything could have been lost." "My dear," Miss Marple replied with gentle firmness, "the truth has a way of emerging eventually, though I confess this particular case troubled me more than most. When someone we trust betrays that trust so completely, it shakes the very foundations of how we understand our neighbors and ourselves." Mrs. Bantry, who had remained silent during the official proceedings, finally found her voice. "I still cannot reconcile the Colonel Melchett we knew with the man who could plan such elaborate murder. His questions, his apparent concern for finding the killer, it all seemed so genuine." "That was perhaps the most chilling aspect of his crime," Miss Marple observed thoughtfully. "His military experience and years of committee service gave him intimate knowledge of how investigations proceed. Every piece of evidence we discovered, every suspect we considered, was carefully orchestrated to guide our inquiry away from the truth while making him appear helpful and concerned." As the Christmas afternoon light began to fade, the villagers gradually departed for their delayed holiday celebrations, each carrying the burden of knowing their peaceful community had harbored such calculated deception. The festive decorations still hung from the rafters, their cheerful colors now seeming somehow incongruous after the morning's grim revelations. Miss Marple gathered her knitting with thoughtful precision, reflecting on the broader implications of what they had witnessed. Mr. Thornfield's systematic blackmail operation had created the conditions for murder, preying upon the vulnerabilities and secrets that existed beneath the surface of even the most respectable lives. Colonel Melchett's response had demonstrated how even honorable people could be driven to dishonorable actions when pushed beyond their limits by shame and desperation. "The village will need time to heal," Mrs. Bantry observed as they prepared to leave. "Knowing that someone we trusted could plan such elaborate deception changes how we see each other, doesn't it? Human nature contains both great capacity for evil and remarkable resilience for good," Miss Marple replied gently. "This tragedy has revealed hidden fractures in our community, but it has also demonstrated that truth can emerge despite the most sophisticated attempts at concealment, and that justice can prevail even when those sworn to uphold it have fallen to temptation." As they stepped into the crisp winter air, Miss Marple reflected that this case had taught her something new about the nature of evil, how it could disguise itself as righteousness, how it could manipulate even the process of justice itself, and how the most dangerous criminals were often those who convinced themselves they were acting for the greater good. The walk home through the village streets revealed the gradual resumption of normal life. Curtains glowed warmly in cottage windows, the scent of delayed Christmas dinners drifted from kitchen doors, and somewhere in the distance, a child's laughter rang out with the resilient joy that marked humanity's capacity for renewal, even after the darkest revelations. In her own parlor, Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair as the small fire crackled cheerfully in the grate. She took up her knitting once more, her needles clicking with their familiar, comforting rhythm while she reflected on the day's events. The businessman who never saw Christmas morning had indeed left his mark on St. Mary Mead, though not in the way he had intended. His death had revealed the hidden corruption that could flourish even in the most peaceful communities, while his killer's sophisticated deception had demonstrated that evil could wear the face of respectability and honor. Yet as the church bells began their evening call to prayer, Miss Marple found herself cautiously optimistic about their community's capacity for healing. The Christmas cactus would return to its windowsill, the silver tongs would be properly cleaned, and life would gradually resume its peaceful rhythm. But none of them would forget the lesson that appearances could deceive, that respectability could mask the darkest intentions, and that the most dangerous enemies were often those who appeared most eager to help. Outside her window, snow began to fall in gentle flakes, covering the village lanes with a clean white blanket that seemed to offer the promise of fresh beginnings. Miss Marple smiled softly as she counted her stitches, reflecting that human nature, with all its capacity for both great good and terrible evil, remained endlessly fascinating to those patient enough to observe it carefully. In St. Mary Mead, beneath the lace curtains and behind the proper hedges, the eternal drama of human hearts continued to unfold, and she would be there to witness it with the gentle wisdom that came from understanding that even the darkest secrets could not ultimately triumph over truth, justice, and the stubborn resilience of communities bound together by something stronger than their individual weaknesses. The mystery of Mr. Thornfield's death was solved. But the deeper mystery of human nature, with all its contradictions, vulnerabilities, and surprising strengths, would continue to provide endless material for contemplation, as long as people gathered together in villages, cities, and all the spaces in between where the ancient dance of trust and betrayal, love and fear, played out its eternal patterns under the watchful eyes of those wise enough to see.